تسأل؟
أنا دكتور.
منو؟
دكتور أنا دكتور عفوا، بس قالوا بالمكتبة أكو ملزمتين للشعور. بهاي الحالة
شباب
لازم.
سمعوني للمرة الأخيرة، أكررها للمرة الأخيرة، إنه فقط المادة اللي أعطيكم إياها هي بالامتحان، أدرسكم وأشرح لكم عليها وأعطيكم إياها PDF. غير هذا ما مقبول أي شيء ثاني، لا من المكتبة سواء مالت العام مالت طولة العام، أي شيء ما مقبول غير المادة اللي أعطيك إياها.
تمام واضح، شكرا دكتور.
هسه واضحة الصورة البقية الطلاب سمعتونا؟
نعم دكتور.
هسه البرزنتيشن واضح قدامكم؟
واضح.
اوكي. بما انه واضح البرزنتيشن, let's begin presenting the lecture of today, that is going to be about Sir Philip Sidney's poetry and his famous poem Ring Out Your Bells. So starting from the beginning, the lecture is going to include 8 sections. The first section is Sir Philip Sidney's poetry or his poetry in general, the critical responses of the poetry of Sidney, then the poem Ring Out Your Bells, more than this, Hassan Muhammad, بس صوت المايك. The summary of the poem. 5, the analysis or the critical analysis of the poem. 6, the form and devices. 7 is going to be the literary elements or elements used by the poets in the poem. And the last one is going to be themes that have been manifested in the poem through the study of Ring Out Your Bells. Anyhow, started by the first one, or the first the first point, the lecture, the first part of the lecture is going to be the poetry of Sir Philip Sidney. Let's check out the poetry of Sir Philip Sidney. This section of the poem again is going to be divided in 2 parts. The poetry of Sir Philip Sidney is going to be given into 7 parts. The first one, Elizabethan courts. Then number 2, the court poets, the Psalms of David, Astrophel and the Stella, the sequence of sonnets written by Sir Philip Sidney, the use of rhetoric or uses of rhetoric, Petrarchanism, and love and courtly behavior of Sir Philip Sidney in his poetry. Starting by the beginning, Sir Philip Sidney was educated to impress an unusual degree of political, religious, and cultural responsibility. Yet it is clear from his comments in defense of poesy that he took his literary role as seriously. Both this critical treatise and Astrophel and Stella are manifesto، يعني اعتبرهن كبيان للتعبير عن شعره، manifestos, not only of poetic but also of broader cultural rights. Both look forward to a long-needed renaissance of poetry and culture generally. For Sidney, poetry and its broader social uses were inseparable. Indeed, it is only with distortion that one can separate a literary form, a social text, even with a Petrarchan love sequence such as Astrophel and Stella. Like other Elizabethan court poets, Sidney wrote his poetry within a structure of power and tried to crave out a discursive space under ideological pressures that attempted to control and direct the language by which the court operated. So, starting by the first point of the poetry, or the first section of the poetry of Sir Philip Sidney, the Elizabethan court. طبعا نسبة إلى Queen Elizabeth the First. The court was more than a visible institution for Sidney and his contemporaries. It was a felt pressure that attempted to fix and determine all that came within its reach. Sidney's life and poetry are especially interesting example of how the Elizabethan court's power operates on poetry. The court poets, for example, Sir Walter Raleigh and the Earl of Oxford, acted as spokespeople for the court's values, yet inevitably the strain and tension of their role show achieved synthesis of court values. Sidney's own position in the court makes his poetry and especially revealing an instance of the struggle and tension beneath the seemingly replete surface of the court and court poetry alike. More than any of his contemporaries before John Donne and Shakespeare, Sidney in his poetry evoke a felt world of bustling activity, physical pressure, cultural demand, in short, the workings of power on literary historical discourse. The institutions that shape the poetry, the court, its household arrangement, its religious and political controversies are evoked in the torment
الصوت ماكو بس يمي لو كلها
خلاص كذا الصوت جاي يروح.
يم الكل.
دكتور ليفت.
وضعي هاي والله العظيم.
العفو، وين جاي يقرأ الدكتور؟
أعتقد يدز المحاضرة ورا ما يخلص.
من ملزمة هو عنده وما مطلني.
لا عاد غير نأشر هسه احنا وياه.
ما عندنا ملزمة، هو يقرأ وبعدين يدز لنا المحاضرة.
ويقول يدرسوا بس هذين اللي تسنك.
لا بالعكس شلون؟
بالعكس،
لأن إحنا طلاب نازلين من السما فنفهم على القدرة يعني هيك عاملين.
ما شاء الله علينا.
أي
صحيح.
طلاب ما يصير هيك حاجة.
بس
ترى ما يصير هيك حالة، يعني لا جاي نفتهم لا جاي نقدر ندرس، حتى اللي ندرسه ما نعرف شنو ندرسه، يعني حتى تجي امتحانات نكش ما فاتحين كتب، يعني واحد يكتب ليش يبوج
ما نعرف شنو المطلوب من عندنا.
ما تقدرين تفهميها إذا ما تمشين وياه سطر بسطر.
هذه يجي ويسأل، ترى بالأخير ما تحصلونه، يروح الدكتور النت يفصل.
ما نفهم شنو المطلوب من عندنا.
اي يعني هي مجرد جاي يحكي على رؤوس أقلام ترى، يعني هنا وملزمة رؤوس تعرف كلش بعد.
يعني أقعد أقراها كلها أنا ولازم أحفظها كلها درخ شيني.
إذا
لا
أطلع
ماكو
وارجع
شيء
يصير؟ ألو
عادي روح كان.
يلا لحظة.
ويدز لي جريدة الصباح يودي هذيك.
هسه هو 28 ورقة، زين هاي 28 ورقة كلها ندرسها؟ ما فاهمة
صحيح. ترى 28 ورقة ناخذها ورايح هاي جديدة الله أعلم يا شهد.
لازم انت تطلع مثلا اسم شاعر او هاي وش الحين عليك وشين تعريفه وشين مو كذا الدرس.
اوكي طلابنا اوكي سوري يعني انقطعت الكهرباء ورجعت في قسم اللغة الانجليزية. طلاب تسمعونا؟
نعم دكتور.
اي نعم دكتور.
نعم.
اوكي
دكتور بس اكو مشكلة انه ما جاي نقدر نتابع وياك على الملزمة، يعني ريت تحدد لنا وين جاي تقرا دكتور.
يا اخي ألف مرة انزلها لكم بعد هسه بس اخلص انزل لك اياها PDF.
يعني دكتور ما نازل
بعدني ما جاي ما تفهمون لا شلون طلاب انجليزي وما تعرفون حكي انجليزي.
دكتور غير نتابع، يعني انت تقرا واحنا نتابع وياك
مو شرط
يعني
مو جاي انا ما عندي شيء. انا بعدني ما مجمع الماده خل اجمعها وادزها لك. زين انت تعال يعني معقوله لا تقولون ما نفتهم. يعني طالب انجليزي مرحله ثانيه يحكي لي انجليزي يقول لي ما اعرف.
دكتور بس العفو من عندك، احنا الشعر اول سنه ندرسه فحتى طريقه دراستها ما نعرفها، يعني هسه غير نتابع
ما له علاقه شعر او جرامر او اي شيء، هو نفس الشيء، هو كلها لغه انجليزيه. هي كلها لغه انجليزيه يعني قبل ما ابو الجرامر يحكي عربي واحنا نحكي انجليزي، هو كله جرامر.
الجرامر عندنا كتاب نتابع وياه ونعرف الاسئله تجي سؤال وجواب ونجاوبها، بس الشعر حتى ما نعرف شلون تجي الاسئله.
هسه شنو علاقتك بالاسئله يا عيني؟ احنا ما جاي نحكي على اسئله، جاي القي لك محاضره اسمع وافتهم. شلون واحد جاي يسولف لك سالفه هسه بالبيت من واحد يسولف مو نفك حلوقنا عليه ونفهم بس نفتهم شنو يريد؟ نفس الطريقه هي سوالف جاي اسولف انا جاي اسوي يعني مو مختبر وجاي احلل الان وجاي اصنع صواريخ او فشي. هي مجرد جاي نسولف لك عن شعره، هذا الشعر وهكذا يشتغل هو الرجل. على كل سمع الصوت ولا لا؟
ليرسا.
نعم دكتور.
نعم دكتور.
Okay, returning back again for the poetry of Sir Philip Sidney. All of Sidney's works are permeated with the problem of authority and submission. Like himself, all of his heroes, including his sonnets or the sequence of sonnets Astrophil and Stella, are young, noble, well-educated and well-intentioned. But as they become aware of complexities and ambiguities of the world, they became diverted or confused, and Sidney find himself cuffed between compassion and condemnation of their activities. In Arcadia، طبعا الأركاديا أحد كتاباته الشهيرة جدا، مجموعة شعرية ضخمة. In Arcadia, Sidney attempted to solve in fiction many of the tensions that beset his life. And Astrophil and Distilla, a sequence of sonnet، يعني مجموعة قصائد كتبت على شكل sonnet، مجموعة كلش كبيرة يعني تتجاوز 100 sonnet. Similarly served as an outlet for political and social frustration. In the prose romance, Sidney's narrative irresolution and premature and repressive closure reveal deep and unsettling doubts. Similarly, the ambivalences and hesitations, the shifting distance between poet and character, and the divided responses to intellectual and emotional demand in Astrophil and Distilla articulates يعني تبين Sidney's ambivalent role within the court. This is what's in relation to the first part of his poetry. The second part here, number 2, the court poets. When Sidney returned from his grand tour، يعني Sidney, Sir Philip Sidney, Sir Thomas White before him, those poets were poets and diplomatics working in the states or in the governments of England. يعني كانوا رجال سياسة ورجال شعراء. Most of them have been sent out of England to different countries to be like ambassadors، يعني or to represent England as ambassadors. يعني أكثرهم أرسلوهم خارج إنجلند على شكل بعثات دبلوماسية يمثلون الدولة. Among them Sidney. When Sidney returned from his grand tour, he looked back across the channel to the sophisticated academics or academies and court schools that were encouraging writers, scholars and musicians, and what were united by a synthesis of a Christian, usually Protestant piety and high Napoleonism or Napoleonism. The French academies in particular displayed a self-consciousness that distinguished them very strongly from the medieval courts. Shortly after Sidney's return, his sister Mary became the Countess of Bernburg.
دكتور العفو،
اتفضل.
ماكو صورة دكتور، بس صوت.
ليش هاي الصورة مسوي لك مشاركة على الصورة؟
ماكو يا ماكو.
لا دكتور ماكو شيء، بس صوت.
ماكو سكرين.
راح أعود أي مو جاي تنقطع النت ضعيف. Now we are discussing point number 2, the court and the relationship between the court and Sir Philip Sidney. See, already we said that. Yes, please. أي واحد عنده المايك مالته مفتوح رجاء نخلي شوية يسد المايك لأن أكو صوت. زينب، طالبة زينب بس سدي المايك. طلاب بس المايك بلا زحمة، مو صوت العائلة كله طالع يمنا، أهلكم جاي يسولفون وجاي ما أدري شو كله يمنا طالع الصوت. Anyway. Okay, returning back to the second point, as we have citruses that shortly after Sidney's return, his sister Mary became the Countess of Bernburg and established at Wilton what one of her followers was to term a little court, dedicated both before and after his death. So the dedication of this court to continuing the renaissance of English courtly culture. Sydney's whole literary career became a frustrated attempt to realize a new rule for the court poets, one based on the integrity and responsibility of values that he was unable to embody in his public life, and that more and more he poured into his writing. His remark to the Earl of Leicester that he was kept from the court since my only service is speech, and that is stopped, has wider application than to its occasion, the French marriage crisis. It articulates a frustration toward the traditional subversience of a poet to the court, a stubborn insistence on forging a distinctive rule for the poets. Part of the fascination Sydney has traditionally evoked is what is often perceived as his ability to balance opposite ideological, rhetorical, or vocational demands of him. Secondly, in defense of poesy، طبعا defense of poesy يعني مقالة شهيرة جدا كتبها سير فيليب سيدني and Astrophil and Stella اللي هي مجموعة شعرية كاملة. The elements of such a dialectic can be found. The promise of divinity that Astrophil perceives in Stella's eyes is in Sydney's sympathetic comedy. Wittily undermined by his self-consciousness, bashfulness, physical oversin, and human imperfection. In defense of poesy, Sydney's طبعا نرجع ونقول defense of poesy اللي هي مجموعة أو كتابات نقدية للشاعر أو prose writing للشاعر سير فيليب سيدني. Sydney describes poetry as a fervent reaching for the sublime, veiling truth to draw its reader towards it, and asserts that the power to move and so to bring about an enactment of poetry's transforming powers certainly lies within humankind's godlike nature. For Sydney there was the seemingly inseparable problems of humanity, infected will اللي هي البروبلم of infected will شلون نقول يعني السريرة السيئة أو النية السيئة للإنسان, and the reformed emphasis on human depravity and the untrustworthiness of the mind seems to have both crucial problems for him and for the possibility of creating a Protestant poetic. Despite this, elements of an opposition between rhetoric and the truth, humanism and piety, Calvin and Castiglione, can be isolated despite his most annexous intentions. Sydney does not manage to hold them together satisfactorily. In fact, his very fascination for later ages and his centrality for understanding 16th century poetry are grounded in such contradictions. Unresolved and continuing conflict in Stephen's Greenblatt's phrase, يعني طبعا Stephen's Greenblatt ناقد تكلم عن الشاعر سير فيليب سيدني. شنو قال؟ A phrase is a distinctive marks of Renaissance culture, and Sydney's is a central place in that culture. This is what concerns point number 2. Number 3, the Psalms or the Psalms of David. يعني النصوص مقدسة هذه اللي ترجمها أو كتب عنها الشاعر سير فيليب سيدني. ديفيد اللي هو تعرفون يمكن نبي الله داود، ديفيد مقابلة في اللغة. The versification of Psalms started by Sidney about 1579 and revised and completed by his sister, the Countess of Pembroke. After his death, comprised the first post-Reformation religious lyrics that combine the rich emotional and spiritual life of Protestantism with the new rhetorical riches of the secular lyrics. There are distinctive Protestant notes, a strong stress on election in Psalms number 43, echoing Theodore Beza and Calvin glosses rather than the original text, for example, and other psalms were a strain of court Neoplatonism and highlighted notably in the Psalms or Psalms number 8, which presents humanity as a privilege, a glorious creation attended by God, an owner of regal and a crowning honor. A humanity or a human emerge as a free and wondrous being like their creator, freely ranging within the zodiac of his own wit. As Sidney put it or claimed it in the defense of poesy, here Sidney put together without integration them the great contemporaries of his age. It is now generally believed that the Psalms were originally drafted by Sidney early in his career, perhaps about 1579. Also written in his early period are a number of miscellaneous poems, including the so-called certain sonnets. يعني في بداية كتاباته هواي كتب من ضمنها السالمز ومجموعة شعرية اللي تسمى certain sonnets, and many of the poem inserted into Arcadia. الأركيديا هي المجموعة الأكبر. These are mainly of interest for showing Sidney's eager experimentation with a quantitative verse, pastoral dialogue, song, metrical and stanzic pattern, and above all, the appeal to the feelings of the reader, notably in Love Me, Oh Love Me, which reaches but to dust, and the magnificent doubt, Cynthia from Arcadia. This is what's concerned number 3. Number 4, the most significance for the study of the poetry of Sir Philip Sidney is the discussion of Astrophel and the Stella. In short, we are going to talk about Astrophel and the Stella. Astrophel and the Stella is a short, a collection of sonnets. طبعا هذه تشوفونها قدامكم هنا بالعرض، تشوفونها قدامكم طلاب؟
Yes.
اللي هي Astrophel and the Stella number 4, a sequence of sonnet، يعني مجموعة من قصائد شعرية غنائية composed in 1580s، يعني في نهاية القرن السادس عشر تقريبا. Astrophel and the Stella is an English sonnet sequence containing 108 sonnet، يعني 108 sonnet and 11 songs و11 أغنية. طبعا Astrophel and the Stella, 2 words. These two came from or have been driven from a Greek words, astra or which means star, and fill, which means lever, and the Latin word stella, meaning or means star. So the whole meaning of astrophil and stella means the lever of stars. طلاب بس صوتكم حتى نوضح لك المعنى مالتها. Okay, returning back. حسن علي بس شوي صوت المايك مالتكم. Astrophil and stella, these two words have been driven from a Greek word. Astra means star, phil means lever, and the Latin word stella means star. The whole meaning astrophil and stella, the lever of a star. يعني تصبح the lever of a star. محب النجوم. And these sonnets اللي هي astrophil and stella, this sequence of sonnet, Sir Philip Sidney adopted or uses the Petrarchian rhyme scheme اللي هي ABBAACC اللي متبعة في الأستروفيل and stella. طبعا the sonnets or the sequence of astrophil and stella, sonnet from 1 to 12 represent the introduction to the sequence as a whole. يعني تمثل الانترودكشن. Sonnet 13 to 30 concentrate on astrophil isolation, with stanza or sonnet 51 to 68 concerning with his moral rebellion. يعني نقصد astrophil, his moral rebellion. Sonnet 71 to 85 is an attempt at seduction and the reminder with his failure, the failure of astrophil. So we'll be returning back to astrophil and stella. Sidney's most sustained and most celebrated work is astrophil and stella in 1582. يعني ما حد متأكد، يمكن 1582 or 1579، ما حد متأكد إنه dates still doubtedly, which dramatize a frustrated lover love affair between a courtier and an admired lady. As agreement Workwitten has shown، يعني هذا ناقد shown بين لنا شنو Sidney may have been tinkering with this certain sonnets during 1581 and 1582, abandoning them the next summer to compose one of three most distinguished sonnet sequence of the English Renaissance.
دكتور صوتك ينقطع يا دكتور.
دكتور صوت ماك.
دكتور صوت
conveys an intensity that suggests a short burst of concentrated writing. هذا النت يا حبيبي، النت يقطع، أنا شو أسوي النت يعني؟ خلي لي برج شباب. الصوت هذا مشكلة، الصوت مو مشكلة باللابتوب هسه حاليا، المشكلة بالنت. النت عندما يضعف إما يصير صوت أو يصير ضجة بعد ما ندري إحنا. سمعون الصوت ولا لا؟
نعم دكتور.
نعم دكتور.
نعم دكتور موجود.
اي نعم دكتور.
سمعون الصوت يا طلابنا؟
نعم دكتور.
اي دكتور نعم.
نسمع.
نعم دكتور.
سمعك.
دكتور هسه نسمعك.
سمعك هسه.
الو مرتضى تسمع الصوت؟
دكتور احنا قاعد نسمع صوتك.
اوكي، ما صوتكم راح من صوتكم من يروح. أنا شنو أتصور إنه جاي ينقطع النت، لازم أنبهكم. تمام. أوكي، يابا على كيفكم وياي، اعطوني مجال. Okay. Returning back to the sequence of Astrophil and Stella. This sequence of 108 sonnet يعني 100 طبعا Astrophil and Stella 108 sonnet. بس صوت المايكات رجاء. The sequence consists of 108 sonnets and 11 songs. Antonymize the love of a young, restless, self-conscious courtier. يعني تتكلمنا عن محب أو عاشق. Astrophil. For a lady, Stella, which represents his star. His purpose is set out in the opening sonnet, in which he claims, I sought fit words to paint the black-set face of woe, studying inventions fine her wits to entertain. يعني من بداية القصائد أو من بداية المجموعة الشعرية أستروفيل الشخصية العاشقة في القصيدة وضح لنا الهدف مالته أو الغرض. The reader is taken into the familiar world of Petrarchian convention and cliches. Astrophil, the doubting, self-conscious, aggressive lover, Stella, the golden-haired, black-eyed, chaste and distant and finally unattainable lady. يعني من البداية عرفنا أنه طريقة القصائد السونت اللي هي sequence of sonnet هي بتراركيان سونت، يعني كتبها بشكل البتراركيان، بها الشاعر المحب أو الشخصية المحبة أو الشخص العاشق يطارد unattainable lady يعني امرأة صعبة المنال. The figure are equally familiar. Debates between hope and absence, denials of loving at first sight, the frustrated desire alleviated by writing, the beautiful woman with the icy heart who pitilessly resists siege, and the final misery of the lover who ends his plaint in anguish, swearing in the end all he has left he absence presence. يعني وصفنا her absence presence يعني إنه حاضرة وغائبة في نفس الوقت. Like the best of Petrarch's sonnets, Sidney makes the traditional motifs intensely dramatic. For the first time in English poetry since Geoffrey Chaucer, C.S. Lewis اللي هو ناقد معروف جدا في الأدب الإنجليزي suggests a situation is not merely written about, it is created, presented so as to compel our imagination. طبعا هذه العبارات اللي كتبها أو اللي قالها C.S. لويس الناقد عن كتابات عن القصائد أستروفيل أند ستيلا اللي هي قال a situation is not merely written about, it is created, presented so as to compel our imagination. Earlier Petrarchian poets such as Thomas White had conveyed urgency and conversational informality, but read as a whole, English poetry had not since Chaucer been distinguished by such continual, even restless conflict and energy. This is what concerned the poetry or the poetry of Sir Philip Sidney, Astrophil and Stella. Number 5, if you can see, the use of rhetoric, يعني الاستعمالات البلاغية أو المجازية في الشعر. The use of rhetoric by Sir Philip Sidney, according to modern critics reacting against earlier impressionistics, romantics criticism, have shown how the energy and variety of Sidney's poetry rest on a thorough exploitation of the rich of Renaissance rhetoric. Through his use of apostrophes, dialogue, ironies, shift in decorum, and modulation of voice. As Ringler points out, طبعا Ringler هو عبارة عن شخص ناقد. Ringler point out أشار إلى perhaps the most valuable products of his studies and disputation in Oxford was the thorough training he received in logical classical rhetorics. To this he added intense study and practice in ways of loosening the rhythmic movements of English line and working within the formal demands of a stanzic and metrical form. By a thorough